Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 23, Confronting the Evil. Yvette Cale had expected to see her husband appear, but as Alexandra Roivas finished the chapter, she blinked her eyes and saw herself standing on a street. Not too far from her, she saw Edward Roivas, and he looked a bit nervous. She wasn't sure when this was, but when she saw a figure coming out of the shadows, she realized it was after the time of the last chapter read. The figure was that of firefighter Michael Edwards. As he walked into view, Yvette could see he had a troubled look in his eyes. It was a look that said the person had seen many things that one couldn't totally comprehend. However, this individual was strong, and she could tell he was coping with it, as well as staying ahead of it. After Michael looked around for a moment, and she could tell he was safe, if only for a moment, she watched as he handed a package to Edward. She realized she had missed part of what Michael had said, especially when she heard his words. "This is something you're gonna need. Don't open it here, but in secret. They can sense it if it isn't shrouded." She watched as Edward looked around for a moment and then asked, "Is it one of the artifacts?" Before she could hear Michael's response, she heard an angelic voice say to her, "It is, but do not fear. Michael is still protected, as is your husband." Yvette turned for a moment and quickly raised her hand to shield her eyes. The glow was blinding, but it was also friendly. She squinted a bit, and for almost an instant, she could have sworn she saw a female figure standing in front of her. As she tried to look more at the figure, the angelic voice continued, "Dr. Roivas is correct about the box, but there is more than that in it. Your husband has helped make sure of that. I know you suspect what he has now determined, and he will be there when you need him. Now he is still healing from his last ordeal." Yvette finally gathered her thoughts and quickly asked the big question on her mind, since she now knew her husband was all right. "Who exactly are you?" The figure answered with a very cryptic response. "You know me, and you don't know me. What I can tell you is that I know of Mantarok's plan, and I am here to aid you. However, know that if you don't aid him, mankind is doomed, and if you do aid him, it may be doomed, but there is hope that it won't be. Now you must return to your own time and get Alexandra down to the array." As the words sank in, Yvette realized one thing was clear. Some of the things she had seen since the beginning had finally made sense. This whole event had been orchestrated from the beginning by Mantarok. That was why she had seen the symbols of the deity under the symbol of Pious Ancient. Before she could ask this unknown figure what more they could do, she was back in the study, and she saw a worried look on Alexandra's face. She realized that Alexandra was thinking the worst, especially as the blonde said in a shaky voice, "Yvette, I think your husband died in the last chapter. He's not here now." Yvette started towards the door of the study and shook her head. "I don't think he is. I had an interesting vision, but right now we need to get down to Enga. She then led the way out of the secret study and towards the library. When they reached the library, she heard Alexandra ask an important question. "Just how are we going to get down there? That hatch is over the ladder down there, and there's no way to move it." She had thought about that, but then she remembered the odd globe and telescope in the observatory. That room was a new addition, and from what she had remembered from Alexandra reading about her grandfather's chapter, the room wasn't in the mansion. It had to have been built for a reason. In that moment it hit her. She quickly opened the door and smiled when she saw a beam of light going into the telescope and shooting out the eyepiece end. She looked around, noticing again the strange fixtures on the wall, and remembered what had been in the safe. "Alexandra, remember the handle we found in the safe? I think we can use it to adjust the light beam. Maybe your grandfather set this up, knowing something about this day would be coming, and he was trying to keep things out of the city." She watched as Alexandra pulled out the handle and plugged it into the controls under the eyepiece. "You might be right. I remember asking him about when I was younger, and he said this is set up for a special event. I think he called it a syzygy, or a planetary alignment. He had mentioned a huge one was happening this..." In that moment she saw Alexandra's eyes go wide, and the girl then started adjusting the path of the light beam to make sure it would be reflected to the globe. As she turned all the handles at each spot, she spoke. "He knew this was coming. It must be a key to summoning an ancient. There have been stories that spells have been cast when there are astronomical phenomena." Yvette watched as the beam started to reflect between the various points. Soon the beam was aimed right at the lens in the globe, and she heard something opening beneath them. When the sound ceased, she headed back to the library door, sure that the hatch was now open. After hearing that sound, they both rushed out of the library and into the main hall. Yvette was about to head towards the basement, but she remembered the vision she had just had. She walked towards the door, which she knew had surprised Alexandra. However, before she could hear Alexandra start to say something, they both heard the sound of someone opening and closing the front door. They both rushed over to the door, and Yvette could see the long parcel on the floor. She smiled, but she noticed Alexandra looked a bit scared. "Now this is a little weird. I thought we had locked the door last time we had opened it." Yvette nodded, but still looked at the package, feeling it was safe. She started to open it. "I think this is what Michael had found with Richard. The last of the ancient's essence, plus a special gladius." When she had it open, she saw she was right, and handed the new blue glowing gladius to Alexandra. "If you want, I'll take the old one." She handed Alexandra the new one, and watched as Alexandra held it for a moment before giving up the old one. "This is nice, and feels different, like it could be thrown as well." She then picked up the sigil of Zelothoth and headed towards the basement door. "Maybe it can be, but would it stay where you threw it, or does it have the mystical ability to come back to you? I don't know if we should try that." As they entered the basement and went down to the room with the hatch, Alexandra nodded in agreement. "Indeed. I could just see it now. I throw it, the creature moves, and it soars out of reach. By this by this point they had reached the hatch, and the vet watched Alexandra descend the ladder. She quickly followed, and was amazed to see they were at the top of a huge circular tower. She glanced back up, realizing that the whole mansion was built on the very top of the tower, and for a moment she feared it would fall down. She pushed that crazy fear away, and then walked to the stairway and started down. They both stayed towards the wall, since there was no railing, and the vet couldn't help but think about the field day her father would have with this place. When she reached the balcony that overlooked the ancient city, she gasped and walked to the railing. In the past, she had seen ruins. After going on some digs with her father and mother. However, when her mother passed and her gifts started up, she went on very few. As she looked upon Enga, she remembered the awe she felt, but more so. Despite the fact that the place was possibly crawling with the minions of Pius's ancient, and the looming doom that Pius represented, she had to let the sight sink in, just in case she would never take the moment to admire it again. Alexandra Roivas looked out at the ancient city, and also noticed how Yvette was admiring it. She did remember who Yvette's father was, and realized that Yvette was looking at the ancient city as any archaeologist might. She even had to admit to herself that it was an awe-inspiring sight. But she brought her mind back to the task at hand. She turned to head back down, and then noticed the symbol in the center of the floor. As she took in the purple rune, she heard Yvette turn and walk to where she was. She heard Yvette make a low murmur, before finally speaking her mind. I had a feeling that this was the case. Alexandra, what does that tell you? She looked at the rune for another moment, and then looked at Yvette. It is a symbol of Mantarok. But does that mean this place was devoted to the dying ancient? She watched as Yvette passed the marking and headed down the steps. She quickly followed as Yvette spoke. Well, think about this. When one form of worship invades another form of worship's area, they usually try to eliminate all signs of the previous. Sometimes some things remain, but not much. It is usually the small markings they get rid of the best, due to their size. How could that marking avoid it, unless the old belief was still alive, still active? As the words sunk in, she realized what her friend was saying. You mean to say that Mantarok's rune is there because Mantarok is the one controlling things? If that is the case, then why isn't Pious worshipping Mantarok instead of Turga? As they neared the bottom, she heard Yvette's response. It could be that Mantarok has a plan to eliminate the other ancients. It could also explain my husband's blink attacks. Mantarok could have arranged for Pious to serve each ancient. That way, by manipulating things, each ancient would be defeated and leave only Mantarok left. The thought that crossed her mind after hearing those words disturbed her. Yvette had made it sound like they were just part of some evil plan. She hoped that wasn't the case, but in a way, it made sense. Then she started to wonder something else. Yvette had mentioned something about her vision, and it caused a ray of hope to shine in her. Yvette, is there another ancient, one that could be a help to us? As they reached the bridge, and she saw the damage that had been done by what her grandfather had done, she heard Yvette answer the question. "Yes, and they saved Richard's life. At least I'm hoping that. They also let me know that my thinking is right, and it's possible that Mantarak might have something in plan to stop us. We just have to act like we don't know that we know about Mantarak's plan." As they entered into the city, Alexandra glanced down the obvious street area and noticed that things were damaged and blocking the side paths. The only place they could go was into the building, which was where the array had to be. Once inside, they both heard a sound that made them turn around. The doorway they had entered now was shielded by a red glowing field. What made things worse was the large hallway appeared to be coated by a yellow glowing field. It was obvious to her that this was meant to keep them from the array and stopping Pious. Before she even stepped forward, she remembered the times a similar floor was encountered in the tome. The only way the others had survived crossing similar areas was placing a high-level shield spell around themselves. Remembering that, she quickly cast the shield and started towards the far end. As she ran, she noticed that with every couple of steps, one of the shielding orbs flew away. The closer she got, the better she felt that she would make it to the door. However, as she got nearer, she also noticed a pattern of runes in front of the door. It had to be a barrier, and she couldn't dispel it at this point. She needed to be off the electrified floor, since it would take time to cast the proper spell. She quickly ran toward the door closest to the barrier and got off the electrified floor. As she turned around after leaving the floor, she noticed that Yvette was following her and was almost out of her shielding orbs when she ran to the same safe spot she was at. It took them both a moment to catch their breath, but it was Yvette who broke the silence. "I guess this was put in place after your grandfather did what he did. Since its color isn't one of the main ancients, this could have been activated after the damage your grandfather has caused. However, it doesn't explain the barrier." They both looked at the barrier marked by the runes and noticed that the color they had was the same one linked to Pius's ancient. In that moment they both looked at each other, and Alexandra knew they were thinking the same thing. Pious had been able to get down here. The hatch wasn't able to stop him. She then smiled. "But we have the ability to stop him now." With a new hope, she cast the spell that would dispel the barrier and then restored her shield. Soon they were both running into the door, and she was amazed at the sight when they entered. The array was apparently still standing, but the room had seen some damage. One of the most notable things was that one of the pedestals was missing its top. Alexandra had wondered if this was more of Pius's doing, but put that thought out of her mind as Yvette started to circle around the array. She did the same, and quickly they both found a piece of the missing part. They brought both pieces to the pedestal, and using magic reassembled the broken pedestal. Once it was complete, Alexandra looked at the array and could see nothing had changed. She looked at the pedestals again and realized what needed to be done. She started placing each of the essences they had gathered on them. Once the last one, the heart of Mantarok, was placed, an ethereal hum filled the room, and they saw the array was now glowing. Alexandra walked around the array again, while Yvette stayed near the three essences. "Any idea on which spell we should use in this thing?" As she walked around wondering which rune would go where, she noticed Yvette was looking at the center spot, which had to be for alignment. "I think that what we need is a summoning spell. At this level, it will bring an ancient to fight Pious." She nodded, and also wondered what they would do once the task was complete. Before she could ask the question, she saw Yvette head to the middle spot and push it. She then heard the pulsing circles appear in the array and looked at Yvette. "Do you want to go first?" She watched as the redhead nodded. "I will. Just give me a gun in case I run into trappers. I'm familiar enough with a sword to handle one." Alexandra was about to ask, but decided not to. She then handed over the tome and the gun, with some ammo. Once she had done that, she saw Yvette run into the circle and disappear from sight. Yvette blinked when she appeared on top of one of the many towers. However, before she moved, she looked around real quick and was glad to see no trappers. She had no desire to start shooting now, especially in such a confined area. If she missed, she couldn't run far enough to get out of range of their suicide attack. Once she was sure there were none about, she ran up the steps to where she would pick the rune of what she figured would be alignment. When she reached the spot, she saw the three runes appear, and she knew she needed to think back. It had gotten confusing to remember which one was the proper rune, since to her husband it changed each time. But what it came down to was which essence they didn't have. They had the one for Mantarok, and that one wasn't a choice. In an instant she remembered which one it was, and quickly set the rune for Ulioth. The image glowed with a pale blue light, and she heard the teleportation circle appear. She cautiously went down to it and entered. Soon the view of the tower over the city shifted into that of another room, with many steps. She held her breath, since she heard the sounds of trappers moving about the room. She cautiously stepped forward, making sure the gun was loaded, and slowly moved through the room. As she moved through the room, she noticed that only one doorway appeared unblocked now. Since she had activated the tower, she figured it unblocked that doorway. However, with other doorways in the room, she knew that either her or Alexandra would pass through the room again. That meant all the trappers had to be eliminated. That thought was foremost on her mind when she saw the first few trappers. She fired 2 shots, killing 2 of them and alerting the others to her location. She was thankful they were blind and hoped she was far enough away to avoid their attack and close enough to kill them. She fired a few more shots, and soon silence filled the room. She then made her way to the door, stopping to refresh her shield. spell. Once she did that, she ran out of the room and across the entry hall and back to the array room door. As she ran, she again heard the angelic voice. I apologize for not clearing the floor. Mantarok still has a link to this ancient city, one that he had established when he first came to this world. I cannot fully shut him out, so I had to do this. If I were to clear out the way, he would know that I am onto his plan. He can only know that when the time is right. Yvette understood entirely, especially as she ran into the array room. She closed the door and gasped for breath as she walked over to Alexandra. 1 down and 8 to go. Be careful, there are trappers out there. As she handed the tome to Alexandra and the gun, she heard Alexandra respond, I understand. I have a feeling the next one we go after will be a Pagan rune. She then watched as Alexandra pressed the stone on the pillar to the right of the one where Yulios' symbol now floated. Alexandra headed towards the teleportation circle after she activated the panel. She looked at Yvette and smiled. I hope this goes as smoothly as yours did. She then stepped into the circle and watched as the array room dissolved out of sight and one of the towers appeared. Before she even moved, she saw that she wasn't alone on the tower. There was a trapper walking around on the high tower, between her and the spot to place the rune. She quickly raised the revolver and fired. She breathed a sigh of relief as the creature fell before it could react to the sound. When it finally died, she quickly ran up and set the Pargon rune. Part of her was glad that all she had to do was pick from one rune, since she was sure they needed to make sure the correct runes were selected. She knew the spell they would cast would be a summoning spell, but she wasn't sure which runes would appear where. She was so focused on that thought she almost yelped when she appeared in a new room. After stepping into the teleportation circle, it was a yelp of surprise since she heard trappers all around her, but she couldn't see them. She quickly realized why. They had to be invisible. She wouldn't be able to shoot them unless she could see them. She remembered the spell that allowed them to see the invisible things, and quickly cast it. Her thoughts were correct, and as she saw all the trappers moving around, unaware of their discovery, she slowly made her way out of the sunken area she had appeared in, and fired. The first one fell, and she saw all turn to face the direction. She took advantage of the moment and fired her next shot at the next one. As more of the trappers fell, Alexandra moved towards the exit of the room. As she did that, she started to wonder what purpose the room had served. It almost seemed like a room to have a meeting in. She pushed those thoughts out of her mind as she left the room and entered another room. She quickly climbed some steps to the only open doorway. That doorway led her back to the room with the electrified floor. She quickly refreshed her shield and then ran back down to the array room door. As she neared the door, she almost panicked as she started to stumble. She had been able to catch herself, but she didn't want to think at how long her shield would last if she had stumbled. She was glad when she fully reached the doorway and entered the array room. She closed the door, took a deep breath, and smiled. 2 down, 7 to go. She then walked over to Yvette, who was standing right next to the next pillar in the sequence. She handed all the items over. It was close. I almost stumbled onto the floor out there. She saw Yvette nod in understanding. All this time, they were worried about monsters and such, and never stopped to consider that a simple misstep had the power to do what the monsters so far couldn't. Yvette prepared herself after hearing Alexandra's statement, and then pushed the stone. Soon the array roared to life, and Yvette took a deep breath. She quickly flashed a thumbs up to Alexandra and stepped into the teleportation circle. Soon she found herself at the top of another tower, and thankfully there were no trappers there. She allowed herself a moment to look over the edge and realized how a stumble could end what they were doing here. The towers had to be very high up over the level of the subterranean city, and at that height a fall would be deadly. She placed that thought out of her mind and approached the spot where she would set the rune. As she got to it, she saw that the only choice available was that of the Pargon rune. Once her choice was made, she thought about it for a moment. So far they had set 2 power runes and an alignment rune. That meant the next one in the sequence would be one of the other 2 runes needed to create the spell. She started to think about which rune to use as she entered the newly active circle. Soon her vision changed from that of the tower over the city to that of a large circular room. Her arrival point was on a raised spot above what either was an arena area or a stage area. She quickly ran down the steps and noticed that the only exit from the room was guarded by a purplish barrier. She started to wonder if Mantarok might be on to the fact that she was more aware than Alexandra of the threat that faced them if they stopped Pious. It was true that they all suspected it, but Yvette was sure of it for the longest time. If that was the case, this room could have been a tomb. However, she also noticed 3 odd obelisks in the room. Each one was devoted to one of the 3 other ancients, and she was sure they were linked to the barrier. At first she thought about destroying them individually, but wondered if the others would retaliate or summon a creature to defend themselves. Also, would the pillars have a way to regenerate themselves? If they did, she needed to destroy all of them at once. When that thought crossed her mind, she smiled as she realized the answer to the problem. She looked at all the pillars again and moved to a spot she was certain to be right in the middle of all of them. She then cast a magical attack spell and smiled when all the pillars exploded and the barrier disappeared. Yvette quickly ran through the doorway and into the room she had appeared in the first time she had returned from a tower. She was glad it was still empty, and took a moment to restore her shield. She then ran out into the main hallway and made her way back to the array room. As she ran past one of the doorways on her right, she felt for a moment that something was watching her. She dared a glance at the doorway, but the red barrier made it hard to see in the room. However, she did notice for the first time that the red barrier had a slight purple haze to it as well. Deep down, it increased a fear that had been building since they had arrived at the mansion. It was the fear that no matter what they did, the darkness was going to consume them. What made it worse was the fact that everything appeared to be manipulated by the fourth ancient, Mantarok. However, she pushed that fear out of her mind as she entered the array room. Alexandra was glad to see Yvette enter. Even though this trip appeared to be shorter than the previous trip, it didn't mean it had been easier. She quickly got all the items she felt she would need. So what happened? She started to walk over to the next pillar to activate it as she heard Yvette explain. I set the Paragon rune, and then was transported to a round chamber. 3 pillars had been in it, each one for one of the 3 ancients Pious could have picked from. They had to be destroyed so I could get back here. Something in her told her that there had to have been more, but part of her didn't want to ask. She then activated the next pillar and headed to the circle. Before she stepped in, she looked at Yvette and said, Yvette, are you worried we might not be doing the right thing? Before she stepped in, she watched as Yvette shook her head and sighed. If we do nothing, mankind will be destroyed. If we do this, then mankind has a chance. Alexandra sighed as well, and then stepped into the teleportation circle. As it happened before, she appeared atop one of the towers. This time there was nothing up there with her. She quickly ascended the steps and reached the screen-like stone. This time, she had to make a choice. Every rune that represented an action was there to pick from. She looked at each one and wondered which one would be correct. As she thought about it, she thought of all the spells they had found and what Pious had been doing. He was going to bring his ancient into the world, and she realized what rune to select. She quickly selected the summon rune, and then headed back to the teleportation circle. She took a deep breath and stepped into the circle, hoping she had made the correct choice. They would need the help of the ancient that could defeat Pious's, and that ancient was Ulioth. She was in the next room and paused for a moment, as the sounds of walking trappers could be heard. She quietly stepped off the point she had arrived at and around a balcony-like area. As she neared some steps, she also noticed that the floor was electrified, and she saw a barrier blocking the way to the exit door. This would be difficult to pass. She stood on the area overlooking the blocked door, wondering how she would safely remove the runes without being attacked by a trapper. She then smiled as the answer hit her. She had a few spells available to her, and quickly started with the attack spell. After she cast it, she heard all the trappers collapse. Now she had to remove the barrier, and that was easily done by dispelling it. She then refreshed her shield and quickly ran onto the electrified floor and back out into the hallway. She didn't stop once, knowing that doing so might be very dangerous. She had just reached the array room door when the last shielding orb flew away. She quickly got in the room and collapsed on the floor, thankful she had just enough time to get to the room. She got up when Yvette got to her side. Yvette ran over to Alexandra when she got in the door and collapsed. She could see the girl wasn't about to pass out, but she could tell that Alexandra had done a bit of running. She quickly took the items she would need and asked, "What happened? Why are you out of breath?" She waited as her friend finally caught her breath and answered the question. "The room I appeared in also had an electrified floor. You may pass through that room too, since I noticed another blocked doorway opposite the door I left through." Yvette nodded in understanding, and then went to the last pillar on the right side of the array. Once she activated it, she headed to the teleportation circle and stepped into it. As the world around her changed, she wondered how they had lucked out so far in only encountering trappers. Could Edward's attempt years ago have eliminated everything but those little creatures? It seemed almost impossible, but so far, that is how it seemed. When she was finally on top of the tower, she took another moment to look out over the underground city and then gaze up. Even though they were underground, she could swear she could see a perfect view of the nighttime sky. In fact, she was certain she was seeing more stars than the modern world would allow at this time. It was a sky uninhibited by modern lights, similar to the view that mankind must have had centuries ago. She stopped musing and then headed up the steps to where the next rune would be set. She wasn't surprised to see the rune was the Paragon rune. In fact, she suspected that it would be that rune. If the layout of the array room reflected a power circle of 9 points, and Alexandra had set one of the runes for the spell, the rest on the right side had to be Paragon. It also told her that if the left side mirrored the right side, the next rune she would set would be the other rune for summoning an ancient to fight Pious. She headed down and stepped into the circle, wondering if it was the right thing to do. As she thought about it, the world changed around her, and as she caught a glimpse of the room she was appearing in, those thoughts left her. The first thing she noticed as the huge room came into view was a huge red barrier and 3 horrors standing behind it. She was sure she couldn't take them all on at once. It also made things difficult that they were all the same alignment. There was no way they would turn on one another. She then remembered the trick that had been used in Michael's time, the bind spell. She quickly cast it using Ulios' alignment, and smiled as a blue halo of lights appeared around the one horror's head, and the others started to fight it. Soon that one fell, and Yvette repeated the trick with the second horror. The second one fell shortly after, as well as the barrier, and left only one left. The way it moved, she could see it was badly injured. Since it wasn't looking in her direction, she quickly ran forward and shoved the gladius into the creature. She backed away as the creature yowled and then collapsed. She was thankful it was quick, and then ran away to the only exit from the room. As she reached the next room, she quickly restored her shield and ran across the electrified floor. At the other end of the room, She quickly restored it again and ran out into the hall to the array room. As she ran towards it, she glanced over at the door that caught her attention before, and tried to catch another glance into the room. As she passed the room, this time she noticed something large moving in the center of the room, but she couldn't tell what. She quickly put it out of her mind, but did not forget about it as she entered the array room. Alexandra was glad to see that Yvette was all right, but she could see that the redhead was a bit shaken up. She walked over and took the tome and the gun as Yvette offered them. "What happened? Something other than trappers?" She felt fear fill her as Yvette nodded. "3 horrors, but I was able to get them to fight amongst themselves. If I hadn't, I don't want to think about what might have happened." She could sense that there was something more, but she could see that Yvette wasn't about to say it yet. Once she had everything she needed, she ran over to the first pillar on the left side of the array and activated it. She then took a deep breath and walked to the teleportation circle. If horrors were now showing up, she had to hope that they didn't start moving in groups. She also hoped that none would be at the top of the towers. Once she stepped into the circle, she was again transported to the top of the tower, and this time she wasn't alone. However, she was fortunate that there were only trappers up there. She quickly shot them dead, and then moved up to the place where to set the rune. As she suspected, this rune was the Paragon rune. She sighed, realizing that soon all the runes would be placed, and they could bring an end to this dark cloud that had been cast over her family. She then walked down to the teleportation circle, pausing only once when something caught her eye. She looked over the edge and noticed that some of the other towers appeared to be glowing a pale blue light. However, the light didn't reach the top of the towers yet. As she stepped back and into the circle, she realized what the glow meant. The towers were powering up for the big spell. Once the last rune was set, the towers would use the power to cast the spell. Also, she gained a new respect for the power the ancient city harnessed. Those thoughts quickly left her when she appeared in the new room and saw a huge pit in the center of the room. She stepped away from where the circle left her and cautiously moved forward. She stopped before she would step into a pit with jagged rocks and hot lava. She then glanced to her left and saw the way out, but this pit blocked the way, and there was no way she could jump it. For a moment she felt like she would never get out, and then she noticed something. It appeared like some dust was floating in midair. She looked at it for a moment and then cast the reveal invisible spell. Soon the pit was filled in, and she realized it had been an illusion. She quickly ran to the door, pausing briefly to restore her shield, and then out the door. She noticed she was in the hall to the array room, and also noticed that the walls here were glowing with a pale blue light as well. As she started across the electrified floor, she wondered how much of the ancient city might be glowing with power. Was the whole city a magical battery, waiting for the array to be powered up? Alexandra put that thought out of her mind as she entered the array room and handed the supplies that would be needed to Yvette. As she handed over the items, She let Yvette know what she saw. "Yvette, I think that once we get all the runes set, this place will be glowing. I've just noticed it now." She then saw Yvette's eyes had gotten wide as the news sank in. When Yvette had the last of the items, she walked over to the next pillar and pressed it. As she did, she paused to look around the array room. Since they had started, a blue glow had been slowly building in the room as well. The only places that didn't glow blue were the two essences that were not Helios. She then walked into the teleportation circle, saying to Alex, "If I'm right, I'll be setting the rune meaning creature, and there's two more Pargon runes." She didn't hear Alexandra's response, because she was already teleporting to the top of one of the towers. When she was on the tower, she started to head up to the spot to set the rune, and then looked around the city from above. She took a moment to see if she could spot where they entered the city from, and quickly spotted it. As she looked at it from the tower, she realized how far they had climbed down, seeing the balcony that overlooked Enga, and how far up it was. In fact, not far from the balcony, she could see the brief outline of a roof, be it a cave roof, or whatever made Enga what it was. She returned her focus to the task at hand, and quickly set the creature rune. Once she did that, she heard the teleportation circle come to life. Yvette quickly ran down to it, pausing briefly to glance at the other towers. The pale blue glow was almost to the top of the tower, but not high enough to reach the top of the tower. She then stepped into the teleportation circle, and wasn't surprised to find herself teleported to a new room. It looked like a waterway came from the room, or ended in the room, but she didn't stop to study it. The room was also home to a few trappers. She slowly moved down the steps, glancing briefly to the only way out of the room, and then aimed the revolver. Soon the room was filled with the firing of the gun, followed by the trappers squealing. The latter's sound ended faster as Yvette quickly adjusted her aim and shot each one in turn. Soon they were all dead, and Yvette restored her shield and ran out the door. She quickly crossed the next room, not stopping once as the floor flickered and briefly appeared to be a pit. She knew it was an illusion. She then entered the long, electrified hallway. As she started towards the array door, her mind wandered to the feminine voice she had heard earlier. She knew it had told her that her husband would be with them to help, and that he needed to recover, but she hoped he would be with them soon. They were very close to completing the circle, and he wasn't back yet. She had started to feel doubt when she heard the voice speak again. "Don't fret, child. He will be joining you soon. You are going to need his help most when the last rune is set." Again, something in the voice soothed her nerves, but her worries weren't completely gone. However, she was calm when she returned to the array room and handed all the items to Alexandra. Alexandra was glad to see Yvette arrive back safely. However, she did notice that Yvette seemed concerned about something. As Alexandra took the stuff so she could take on the next challenge, she asked her friend what was bothering her. "Yvette, I didn't want to pry, but there is something bothering you, I could tell. What is it?" She watched as Yvette looked back towards the door and heard her sigh. "Richard hasn't rejoined us yet, and I have a feeling that something bad is awaiting us after one of these towers. One of the rooms we haven't been in yet has something big in it, and if I'm right, it's linked to Mantarok." Alexandra was shocked by those words. From what she could tell, the only things that might be agents of Mantarok were frail zombies. However, she had noticed the rune on the balcony floor, and Yvette had said his rune was under all the other major runes they had seen. "Do you think it might be a lesser guardian of Mantarok?" She could tell Yvette was unsure, especially as she shook her head. "I'm not sure. There's another possibility, but I don't want to think about that one. Just set the next rune and get back here." She nodded and stepped to the next remaining pillar and pressed it, setting the array in motion again. Once she heard the teleportation circle, she ran right to it and was instantly transported to the top of the next tower. She was thankful that there were no trappers or anything else there. She even started to wonder if there were any more creatures still in the ancient city, or at least the area they had been in. She put that thought out of her mind as she ran up the steps to where she was to set the rune. As both she and Yvette had concluded, it was the Pargon rune. Once she set it, she turned to head down to the teleportation circle. Before she moved, she noticed that now the floor where the circle was at had a pale blue glow. She glanced back at the spot where she set the rune and wondered what would happen when the last rune was set. She put the thought aside and ran down into the teleportation circle. When the world stopped shifting around her, she looked around to see the room she was in was a museum-like room. She also noticed 3 golden circles on the floors, each with the shape of a creature and a color on a sign next to each circle. She walked around the room, examining the circles and the square-shaped holes, before it hit her what she needed to do. She stepped close to the one with a blue trapper and summoned the creature. The second it appeared, she made it step onto the circle. Once it did, she saw it continue walking without any orders from her, and then disappear with the circle, only for it to fill one of the holes. She then moved close to the circle for the red zombie and repeated the process. As it had happened before, the second the zombie shuffled onto the circle, it moved automatically, and faster than it normally would, which surprised her. She then ran over to the spot for the green horror. She made sure she was a few steps away from the circle. She wasn't sure if the creature could pull her into the circle with it if she were too close, and she didn't want to find out. She then summoned the huge creature and watched as it appeared right next to the circle. She made it move one thunderous step forward and watched as it entered the circle. Soon it was in one of the alcoves. As the last creature became frozen in place, she heard a barrier fall. She glanced over at the doorway to the room and noticed the barrier just as it disappeared. She restored her shield and ran through the door. She was in the electrified hallway and made her way straight to the array room. When she reached the door, she glanced back and smiled. noticing only one door other than the main door to the complex remained blocked, and that meant only one room to go. She then ducked in the door before her shield was gone. Yvette was glad when Alexandra had finally returned. When she started handing the stuff to her, Yvette asked the main question on her mind. "Where did you arrive in the place?" She was stunned when her friend answered without stopping. "It was a museum-like room. It had a few of each trapper, zombie, and horror on display in something like cases. I had to summon a few to fill in the empty places. I think after the creatures were put in the case, it filled with some sort of magical stuff to hold them in place or suspended animation. I didn't want to end up like that." Yvette could understand the fear, but now she was sure she would have to face the last room. She walked over to the pillar and activated. Once that was done, she looked over at Alexandra. "You still have the enchanted gladius, right?" When the girl nodded, Yvette walked over to the circle. "If I don't return in 15 minutes, I want you to go and fight Pious. I'm sure that once the rune is set, the teleportation circle will stay open." She stepped into the circle just as Alexandra said, "I will, but I hope you do come back." Deep down, she hoped so too, especially as the final tower came into view around her. She took a deep breath and then noticed there was a trapper on the tower. She slowly raised the revolver and fired. Like always, she had killed it, and then ran up to the top of the tower. When she reached the top of the tower, she set the rune and was amazed by two things. First off, she heard every rune's name speak in the voice that had to be Yulios. Second, all the towers now glowed with a pale blue light. She glanced over the edge and noticed that a blue band now started to ascend the towers. That told her that they had little time to get back to the array. She quickly ran down to the teleportation circle and into it. Soon the scene shifted, and she was in a room with a large pit circled by a glowing purple floor. She stifled a gasp, however, when she saw what was in the center of the pit. It was a huge purple worm. She looked at it, but it acted like she didn't see it. Something told her that the worm was not meant to be seen. She slowly descended the steps to the floor and started to walk to the only exit from the room. As she walked, she acted like there was nothing wrong, but deep down she realized what that thing meant. Somehow Mantarok had a link to the city and could very well be dictating everything that happens. In fact, she was sure of it. Pious finding the tomb of the ancients, the binding of Mantarok, the city of Enga, Uble Cathedral, and the Roivas having their home here was all linked to Mantarok's will. The fifth ancient was right. She was close to the exit when it happened. She heard a ghastly male voice say, "I knew you were special, more special than your father. It was a shame he didn't bring you to the temple. I made sure Pius destroyed your husband. Now I shall make sure you don't alert others to my plans." Yvette spun around in time to be knocked back by the striking creature. She realized then that the worm wasn't an agent of Mantarok, but was Mantarok. The ancient must have encircled the planet and controlled the very forces of the planet. Even this underground city must not have been fully immune. Those thoughts consumed her mind until she hit the ground hard. She had been stunned and realized the real danger she was in as she saw the shielding orbs fly from her. Soon she would be defenseless and a victim to the electrical floor. She wouldn't be able to reach the door in time. As the last orb started to fly away, she realized her end was near, and only a miracle could save her. She was even sure Alexandra wouldn't reach her in time, especially as she heard footsteps and looked towards the array room door to see no one. Richard Cale appeared in the long hallway he was last in with Edward Roivas, but he was not unprepared. The ancient who had let him heal had blessed him with special gifts. The electrified floor would not hurt him, especially as he ran towards his fallen wife. He ran to her and quickly picked her up, preventing the floor's effects from hurting her. When she looked at him, he felt better, especially as she smiled. "A miracle did happen. You arrived at the right time." He held her close as he carried her to the door to the array. As they headed there, he kissed her. Yes, she had told me now was the right time. All 3 summoning spells are happening, and now we have to get to the array. It is possible that Alexandra can handle it alone, but when she is successful, Mantarok has already planned for her fall. His wife gasped as they reached the door. "What do you mean for her fall? He had something planned for when she defeated Pious?" He nodded and told her what he had been allowed to learn during his recovery. Yes, Pious has posed as many people. When he dies, it will be revealed that those he posed as will be dead. The inspector will have been killed by Alex, as evidence is shown that all 3 of us had conspired to kill her grandfather. Evidence will also appear that your father had killed Paul Augustine at Angkor Wat. It may even be that I'll be a suspect in my parents' death. When we win, Mantarok will have us framed so he can take over, with no one who knows the truth able to stop him. They entered the array room and noticed that Alexandra was about to enter the array. She had stopped when they entered, and he could see she was glad to see them. "Richard, you're alive, and back just in time." He wasn't surprised when she rushed over to them and gave them a hug. He then watched as she backed away and could tell something was wrong. Richard quickly told Alexandra what he had learned and heard her gasp in shock. "So, what are we going to do once we defeat Pious? We can't show our faces ever again." Richard nodded and then looked up. "She said she would protect Denga, and she would find a way to lead our loved ones here. She would also make sure others made their way here. In time, we can get others safe areas set up, but she knows Mantarok is ready to send his horrors, trappers, and guardians into the world. She even stated that Mantarok's bone thieves are already in places of power. Almost all of your presidential candidates are controlled by them." He heard Alexandra gasp when she heard that, since it meant that no matter what, her home country and where they were would be under Mantarok's control. They all then looked at the array, seeing the teleportation circle, and Richard knew what they were all thinking. This was it, the point of no return. He also knew that if they didn't go through the circle, they were as good as dead. In fact, he knew the world was dead if they didn't go through. He looked at both his wife and friend. Well, we better do this. If we don't, mankind won't have any future. He watched as both nodded, and they all stepped forward. At that moment, something odd happened. He saw two locations appear before them. The first was the surreal hall that the tome always appeared in, and the second was the area where Pious Augustus was. He watched as his wife walked into the hall, and then as she approached, he noticed that she now appeared atop one of the various towers in Enga. He then saw Alexandra step towards and appear in the area Pious was at. He watched as Pious took notice of Alexandra's arrival and was stunned to see Pious wasn't attacking. The man who Richard now understood was only a tool spoke confidently, not knowing he was also waiting to appear. Miss Roivas, you have arrived just in time. The summoning spell I had started over 2,000 years ago is almost complete. Soon you'll become the first morsel for my lord Chaturga. He lost track of Pious's word after that, as he swore he heard Pious also mention Zelatoth and Ulioth. He was proud when Alexandra didn't back down. You've forgotten what it means to be human, Pious. The human race will never go quietly into the darkness. For years people have been doing what they can to stop you. Now, thanks to their actions, we have the essences of the other ancients. This will end now. He watched as Pious started to advance on Alexandra. It will indeed, Miss Roivas. I'm sure you will be no match for me alone. He then watched as Pious quickly dispelled the shield Alexandra still had in effect. At that moment, Richard stepped forward and watched as Pious paused in shock. But she isn't alone, Pious. Unlike what you had been sure of, I'm still very much alive. He then held out his sword, which had been blessed by the fifth ancient, and glowed a heavenly yellow color. And I am more aware of what is going on than you will ever be. Alexandra noticed that Pious was in shock at Richard's appearance, and took that moment to strike. She was still some distance away, but she felt she needed to swing her gladius at Pious. In that moment it flew out of her hand, and wild glowing blue struck Pious, and then returned to her hand. She was amazed at that. However, she got over the amazement quickly when a red claw-like object appeared. She saw Richard run forward and heard him shout, "Hit that thing now!" She quickly ran toward the object and threw the gladius again. This time it hit the claw, and when it did, for the briefest of moments a surreal hall appeared in view. It had distracted her long enough that she almost didn't notice the magical attack that Pious had launched. She moved at the last second, dodging the attack. She turned to see that Richard had also backed away from Pious. She quickly shouted, "Richard, keep after Pious, and I'll watch for the artifact." She saw him nod and then run forward. Soon his enchanted sword had struck Pious, causing the fiend to step back, allowing Richard to do the same. She then noticed that the claw had appeared close to where Pious spoke with his ancient. Currently, that was nowhere close to where Pious was. She quickly ran up the steps that joined the two areas and attacked the claw. As before, the image of the surreal hall appeared, but this time she wasn't distracted by it. She did, however, hear Pious speak to Richard. "I do not know how you were able to survive the destruction of the Forbidden City, but I'll make sure you wish you had died there." She saw the attack come at the same time Richard did, as they both jumped back as the attack struck right where they had each been standing. She was thankful that Pious hadn't shook Richard's resolve. "It wasn't my time to go, Pious. I had to make sure you didn't bring Chaturga, or whichever one it is, into this world." She then saw how Richard ran, jumping back at the last second as Pious swung his bone staff, and then jumping forward to slash Pious again. In that moment she saw the claw appear right next to Pious. She knew this would be dangerous, but maybe she didn't have to get so close. She got to the top of the steps and let the sword go. She wasn't surprised when it hit the claw, but when it returned to her hand she suddenly felt lightheaded. This wasn't a good thing, especially if Pious could attack her when she was down. She tried to fight it, but it was as if she couldn't keep control of her own body. As everything got dark, she hoped this wasn't the end for her. Yvette was not surprised that from the top of the tower she was on that she could see the battle. What did surprise her was other things. During the battle, it looked like all the artifacts were there. However, that did match up with the sight she could see far above her. As clear as day, on what had to be a ceiling, she saw 3 scenes, where each one of the ancients was battling their superior. 3 battles were happening at once. She was also surprised when she saw the surreal hall, and when the ghost of Elia started to walk out of her statue. She watched as the figure moved to a ghostly form of the tome, and then she noticed Alexandra, looking like she was losing consciousness. She realized what was happening and shouted, "Elia, hit the artifact! It needs to be destroyed!" She then watched as Elia's ghost took over Alexandra's body, and it even looked like Elia now. As her husband kept fighting with Pious, Elia struck the artifact, and Alexandra returned. She watched as Alexandra held back, and realized that the girl realized what had happened. Soon, when Richard struck Pious, and Yvette watched as Alexandra first struck the artifact, and then disappeared to another point, and Anthony's spirit now appeared. As Anthony struck it, she realized what was happening. The spirits of those who fell to the tome were being allowed one last chance. As the battle continued, she noticed that Karim was now the spirit in control, and he also struck a blow to the artifact. In that moment, 3 loud roars echoed throughout Enga. She glanced up and saw that each fight had taken a turn in their favor. All the ancients yelled in pain as their superiors struck them. Once each was wounded, she glanced down at the area where the fight with Pious took place in, and saw the battle had stopped. As they all heard the sounds, she then shouted, "Keep it up! Pious's ancient is starting to lose!" She then watched as the battle continued, and she could tell Pious was getting upset. However, with the latest turn of events, she could see that Pious now appeared worried. Richard had heard his wife's words and realized they truly were winning. He also took advantage of Pious's distraction and swung his blade at Pious. He watched as Pious staggered back from the blow. Again he noticed that Alexandra had been possessed, but this time by Maximilian, and he remembered how slow the colonial Roivus was. He knew that the slow-moving figure would be an easy prey for Pious. He noticed that Pious was about to turn and decided to try and throw the truth of what had happened into Pious's face. "So, Pious, What is it like being the tool of Mantarok, doing what he wants? He jumped back as Pius swung his staff at him, obviously forgetting about Maximilian's ghost. I do not serve that dying weakling. I serve the mighty Chaturga. He noticed that Pius paused for a moment, as if he just noticed something for the first time. Richard knew exactly what he had heard, especially as the distraction did its job and Maximilian struck the claw of Chaturga, which as he glanced at it became the sigil of Zelatoth and the veil of Ulioth before becoming the claw again. He quickly backstepped as Alexandra reappeared and Pius started to launch a magical attack. After narrowly dodging the attack, he smiled when Alexandra threw her gladius again and hit its mark, causing the claw to appear again. As Alexandra ran towards the claw's latest spot, Richard continued his verbal assault. That is who you think you serve. But you heard what I heard. Your voice said all three of those ancients at once. They couldn't have all joined forces to summon you to where their essences were imprisoned. Someone was pulling the strings. He blocked the blow that Pius tried to deliver with his bone staff. He then heard Alexander strike the essence again, which caused Paul Luther's spirit to appear. He blocked another blow as Pius continued the mind games. The only strings that will be pulled will be yours when I use your lifeless corpse to bring your wife to be consumed by my master, Chaturga. As the last word was spoken, the other names joined it, and Pius paused again. The distraction allowed the ghost to strike the essence, and Alexandra to return. Richard quickly pushed Pius back, which caused Pius to stumble. The Ancient of Evil was getting weaker. Richard quickly swung his sword again, which amazed him when it sliced Pius, allowing the essence to appear again. As Alexandra headed to it, he swung again, causing Pius to back up. They were never your master. You were being used to bring them all here to face their destruction at the others. They weren't even aware you were in the ancient city until you picked up an artifact. Only one could make you think they were calling. His last statement was punctuated by Alexandra swinging at the essence, hitting it, and causing the spirit of Roberto to appear. However, he saw the ghost take no time and swing at the claw, causing it to shatter. At that moment, three great roars echoed from the heavens above. Richard chanced to look up and saw each of the ancients that would be Pius getting wounded. Now, with the claw gun, Pius would fall quickly. Richard started to swing his sword more and more, as Alexandra constantly threw her gladius. Each blow weakened Pius more and more, until the evil creature collapsed to the ground, dropping his staff. He didn't want to say more, but he could see that Pius didn't seem to appear in shock as he fell. He watched Pius, even when the three roars had changed into death wails, telling him what he was glad to hear. Alexandra Roivas was glad when Pius fell to the ground. She was about to walk over to the fallen form when she heard the noise. She glanced up, and in that moment she saw the death of all the ancients. In one, Ulioth destroyed Chaturga. In the second, Chaturga dismembered Zelatoth. The last battle showed Zelatoth destroying the mask known as Ulioth. That sight eased Alexandra's pain, the pain of the loss of her grandfather, but it wasn't enough. She walked over to Pius and picked up his staff. It had been the symbol of his power, but knowing how he got it, she wondered if he would admit it. She looked down at the prone form, who just looked back at her. She wanted to hear him admit he had been used, but the last words he spoke didn't say that. The darkness shall prevail. This was only the beginning. When she heard those words, she was more determined to stop his evil, and stabbed the end of his staff right through him. She was now certain that this was over. However, the second she released the staff, she saw visions of what was about to happen now. She saw all three of the ancients, the versions she had summoned, which shouldn't exist now, coming to feast on humanity. She blinked and looked up to see that the huge figures were now coming towards Earth, unaware of the other's illogical existence. She glanced over at Richard with tears in her eyes. "What have we done? Did we do the right thing? How will we stop it?" She watched as Richard motioned towards where Pious must have spoken with his ancient, showing there was an image of the surreal hall, and a figure stepped out of one of the statues. She almost gasped as it walked over to where the book would have been. Seeing it filled her with hope that things would work out. Yvette was amazed to see the ghost of Edward Roivas walking through the surreal hall. As he walked, he appeared to disappear, only to reappear on another tower. He only said a few words as he headed to the tip. "Quickly! We must bind that creature before it reaches Earth." She quickly understood, and ran to the tip of the tower, and for the first time the runes weren't singular, but groups, with one being dominant over the others. She quickly switched it to be the one that had been weaker than Chaturga. Being in the high point, once she set that, all the towers turned green. She glanced over at the ghost and saw he had set a rune as well. As she looked up, she watched as each ancient started to struggle as it was sucked out of the universe through a circle of runes. It was a sign that the day of the ancients was completely over. She then took a step down from the tower and was stunned to find herself standing with Richard, Alexandra, and the ghost of Edward Roivas. As they stood there, she heard Edward speak to them all. "I wish I could have told you all more about this, but I wasn't sure how to explain it. I'm sorry most of all to you, Alexandra, that I didn't tell you more when I was alive. I am grateful that you learned the real truth. I know the times are going to be tough ahead, but I know you all can do it. Do not lose faith, and trust the one protecting you. In time, others will join to help fight off the darkness. The fact that all of you can now see beyond the veil means hope for humanity." Yvette held back her tears as Edward disappeared. She then looked at her husband, who seemed calm. She looked at Richard and then at Alexandra, and then noticed that they were in the city of Enga, and it was now glowing a golden yellow light. It didn't appear dangerous, like the floor of the hall had been, but it felt good. As she stood there, she felt refreshed. She then noticed that Alexandra had pulled out the Tome of Eternal Darkness. It had been key in what had happened, but she didn't want to look in it. It had been one of Mantarok's tools. They all looked at it, pondering what their next move would be, but they had a good idea of what it would be. She then looked out at Enga, and when she did, they all nodded, knowing what their future was.